Hello and welcome to week 3 of University Foundations 100. For this week you have been reading chapter 7 of Plato's Republic. This is probably the most famous chapter from this book, from his work, because it contains the allegory of the cave, which is used in many discussions of Plato. So we thought we'd like to give you a little bit of background since you're only reading chapter 7 and there's a whole work leading up to it that would give you some background on the whole of the Republic.
So, like Steph mentioned, in your textbook you have more than what we're even assigning to you, and so you are encouraged, welcome to read those other pieces if you want to, but even that's just a piece of a larger work. This is Plato's most famous work. This is a late work in his life, so he wrote a lot of dialogues leading up to this, in which, of course, Socrates is usually the main character, like we saw in Meno and in Protagoras. But the Republic is a lot of things, and it's very, very influential. So on the one hand, it is a description of what Plato, or Plato's Socrates, thinks would be a perfect society. So talking about the form of government, the style of education, all sorts of things about how that society would work. So it's the first in a series of how many utopian pieces of utopian literature where people envision what they think a perfect society should be like. And it's also, a large section of the book is an extended discussion about justice, what it means to be just, which has a lot to do with the discussion of virtue that we had with Meno and with Protagoras. So what does it mean for our society to be just, to treat people with justice? And like in true Socratic style, it goes back to trying to define that term. What does it mean to be just? It's also a sometimes heated conversation about what makes a good government. So the political kind of fighting, debating that goes on in our society is certainly not a new thing. I mean, it's been going on at least since Plato's time, trying to decide what a good government should be like, how it should be set up, who should rule, how those rulers should be chosen, how long they should rule. So just like we are trying to decide in every election that we hold in our country, those same kind of principles. And it is also, in some ways, a justification for class division. So Plato basically thinks that society should be broken up into at least 3 classes. At the bottom would be the laboring class. In the middle would be the guardians, would be the warrior class who would watch over society. And at the top would be the philosopher kings who would rule over society. And so in some ways it seems pretty old-fashioned. You've got this sort of rigid class division. But as you read, you hopefully will get the sense that it's not quite so rigid, that there's some fluidity, and that Plato is not suggesting that the children of philosopher kings should be philosopher kings, but that everyone should have the opportunity to be sorted in a sort of Manan Theory 1 way, to find their strengths, to find out their nature, and to find out who is suited for the kind of training and education that would make them be able to be philosopher kings. And I don't know, Steph, you want to talk about that last one?
Sure. Like how she threw that to me? We think that one of the interesting things about Plato here is that he offers a very progressive vision of human potential. Like Jen said it a minute ago, we're not looking at a class system that's handed down through families, but rather at identifying people through how they perform in their education from a very young age, identifying the people that are best suited for serving their city-state. Because this is all about your duty to your city-state. It's not about your duty to yourself. These are very selfless acts that people do when they decide that, in his ideal situation, how it's decided what role they will serve. Notice also that Socrates/Plato had no problem with women being rulers either. There's a very long section in one of the earlier chapters where he has a dialectic discussion with some of his students about whether women can be suited to rule or not. And Socrates, Plato, believes that they are. So in that way, he was way ahead of people that were his contemporaries and also people that have come after.
And I want to point out, too, that, like I mentioned before, a lot of these questions are still questions that we are grappling with in our society about, how do we give everyone an equal playing field? How do we make sure that people's abilities are fostered to the greatest extent? Whose responsibility is it to do that? Do we do that as a government? Is it family's responsibility? So, we make a big deal about trying to suggest that we're making everybody equal, not to the point of taking children away from their parents and sending them out in the country to live with someone else, like Plato suggests. But you can see some of the rationale. I mean, how is that so different from having a state-sponsored preschool that children go in from the earliest age, where they are taught and inculcated in certain values and that sort of thing? So,
and sorted.
Yes, certainly, looking for those strengths. So Book 7 of the Republic is broken into two major parts. And the first part, as Steph mentioned, is the very, very famous allegory of the cave. And you will be talking about this in other contexts this week in this class, and you'll probably come across this lots of other places as well. So hopefully you got a pretty clear sense from this, or maybe from the podcast or the little videos that we've given you about what Plato is talking about in his allegory of how people become enlightened / educated, and what a painful process this is, that he suggests that most of us are very happy just dealing with the pieces of reality that are fed to us, or the shadows of reality that are fed to us, and don't even want to think that there's something more than this, that
you don't want to turn your head. Well, yes, and one of the fun things we were talking about before we started this recording was how, for each of us, when we first encountered this, the Republic and the allegory of the cave, when we were very beginning college or younger, that it just blew our minds. This idea that, wow, what if all we really think is real is just a mere shadow of the truth of life? Sorry, my vocabulary is leaving me. But that this was such a powerful idea, that we really are held prisoner, and what we think is our grand experience and what we know with certainty is true is just a very poor imitation of the reality.
And I think that we have this kind of experience over and over. At least I know I've had this experience where I think I've got things figured out, right? Mm-hmm. I know just how things are, and then something happens to show me that what I thought I knew was just a very small piece, or sometimes a very false reflection of something else, something larger that I had no idea that I was unprepared. So for instance, like before I went to college, I thought I knew what career I wanted to be. I thought I knew even what my choices were, because I looked at my friends' parents and my parents and, oh, that's what you can be. And then I got to college and you can study that? What? You can become that? And I still feel floored sometimes by how many careers there are that are possible for people to make a living at that I never thought of before. I don't know if that's a true cave moment, but certainly an expanding of, I thought I had things pretty figured out, and wait, there's a whole universe of ideas that I had no idea about.
Well, and I like the idea, too, that education is not something, that the emergence from the cave, for those who actually do it, is not something that's easy. And when you do make it out, you're blinded by the sunlight, and you don't know what it is, and then you still can't see things clearly when you're out of the cave because, well, we all know what it's like to come out of a dark room into the sunlight, and things are kind of, you're blinded and you have sunspots in your eyes. And that's this metaphor for how when you come to enlightenment, it takes a while to settle down and understand the truth of what you're seeing.
And accept it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's it's here on close to the beginning of the section that we've been reading. Plato's Socrates describes it by saying, by talking about if coming out of that cave, and if he were further compelled to gaze at the light itself, would not his eyes be distressed, do you think? Would he not shrink and turn away to the things which he could see distinctly, and consider them to be really clearer than the things pointed out to him? Just so, says his companion. And if someone were to drag him violently up the rough and steep ascent from the cave, and refuse to let him go until he had drawn him out into the light of the sun, do you not think that he would be vexed and indignant at such treatment, and on reaching the light would he not find his eyes so dazzled by the glare as to be incapable of making out so much as one of the objects that are now called true? So I like that very violent description of what teachers do. We're dragging people up the rough and steep ascent. But I mean, he really presents this as something that people are often very unwilling to do, because it's very painful to question the things that you think you know, right? No, this is how it is. And, even in math you say, well, I know that, that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, because I've been taught that it's a truth. And then I remember, teachers making you prove that. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't want to do that work. I don't want to know. I just want to accept what I'm given. All right, I'm fine with that. So it's so much more work.
Well, complacency is comfortable. We know that. We know that from our own experience and from the experience of people around them. And so I think it's important that that's acknowledged in the Republic, that it is difficult to get people to want to know more. It's easy to sit with your beer on the couch and watch your usual newscast or whatever. It's a lot harder to go out seeking knowledge to find out perhaps the truth behind that. And whether you ever make it out of the cave or not, that's still something different.
I just wanted to, my computer's just trying to shut down. I thought we weren't doing anything. Sorry.
Anyway, that's why we're asking you to share your cave stories, your coming out of the cave stories in this week's assignment.
So the second part of this chapter, which in many ways is as interesting or maybe even more interesting than the allegory of the cave section, is this question about what kind of education it takes to be a leader. And I think first of all, it's interesting that Socrates suggests that leaders should be educated differently from other people. Mm-hmm. So earlier in the Republic, he sets forth, that the guardians, this warrior class, should be educated in gymnastics for the body and in music, and music meaning like the poems of Homer, by the way. So this isn't just like Barney or something like that, but
no rap music.
Yeah, this is, moral and religious education, that you'd be taught what is right and wrong through this musical training, which I guess we often still do with. I know that my kids learned a song about cleaning up, which I really appreciated.
Yeah,
because they learned that was a good thing.
That's a Barney song, though.
Yes,
by the way.
that's true. Sad but true. So that first part of the education was for a much larger group. But then when in chapter 7, in book 7, when they're talking about the philosopher kings, Socrates suggests that that's not enough. That if you're going to be in this position of leadership, you need more of an education, or
much more.
Yeah, in different things.
And not only do you need more of an education, you must prove yourself worthy of that education in order to be passed on to the next level. So gymnastics and music is for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. As children.
Yeah. And I think gymnastics not necessarily meaning here round off, back handspring, but physical exercise of some kind.
You know what they're trying to cut out of a lot of public schools now, because it takes too much time away from math, I guess.
Yeah. Which we might not need anyway if we're not going to be ruling the society, huh?
There you go.
So the first thing that Socrates suggests that should be different. Well, actually, he doesn't just suggest it. Doesn't he he tries to help his listeners come to this knowledge themselves. That the kind of skills that these leaders need to learn are those skills that will teach them how to think, and not just think about regurgitating stuff, but think about thinking. So he suggests that calculation, geometry,
astronomy,
that those things will teach them not just how to regurgitate knowledge. And I'm trying to think where exactly. Yeah, this is something that's going to help them to develop their ability to think, their judgment, which leaders are going to need in a way that the soldiers who are following the leaders' rules, I guess, don't have to be able to think about those same things.
That's interesting. He sees all this stuff that falls into mathematics basically as gymnastics for the mind.
Yeah.
It makes the mind fit to move on.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're sitting there wondering why you ever had to take high school algebra or geometry, Socrates has an answer for you. It makes you fit to move on to rule. Which my mother told me too when I was arguing about why I had to take geometry in high school.
And it's interesting that he says as long as it's studied in the right way. So he says calculation needs to be studied for the sake of knowledge and not for purposes of trade, because it mightily draws the soul upward and compels it to reason about numbers themselves. So the idea that a good study, a true study of mathematics, is not just, so now I can balance my checkbook really well, but it gets you to start thinking about the whole concepts behind these numbers. I don't know if I'm there with mathematics.
We're still in the cave.
With that, at least. And so then the other side of it is this emphasis on dialectic.
And this is like the PhD work for Socrates. You have to have come through and passed all the tests with your mathematics, gymnastics, music, mathematics, and then when you prove yourself worthy of moving on, only then can you be introduced to dialectical reasoning.
Yeah, so it's like you get sorted and sorted and sorted and sorted again. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for this is because he suggests that learning dialectical reasoning, this argumentative form of coming to the truth, which Socrates models, can be really dangerous if you're not prepared for it, right? So people that are too young might get so caught up in the arguing side of it that they forget that the purpose is trying to find truth.
On page 73, he says, we should forbid their meddling in it while they're young. For I suppose you've noticed, whenever boys taste argument for the first time, they pervert it into an amusement and always employ it for the purposes of contradiction, and imitate in their own persons the refutations of those who refuted them, delighting like puppies in pulling and tearing to pieces with argument anyone who comes near to them. Just as applied to law school. Middle school. Do not teach your middle schooler argument. They will use it against you. You probably already know that.
And I think Plato was also making a jab here at these teachers during his own time called the Sophists, that were so much about their rhetorical skills, their ability to argue, that it didn't really matter what they were arguing for. They just wanted to be good at arguing. And he thought that argument should always be linked to morality, right? To some belief in good and the true, and to the service of society, what's really going to be beneficial to everyone, not just for the sake of arguing itself.
That's true. He's always trying to discover what is the truth. And this is the Socratic method that we've talked about elsewhere, that Socrates is this. I love this about this. He's always asking the most basic question in all of his discussion is, what is the right way to live your life? And so he's not arguing to win. He's not arguing for power. He's arguing for what he sees as the highest stake of all, is what is the right way to live a life, the just way to live a life.
Right.
And I also think it's interesting that he looks at age, at when you're old enough to really be able to investigate this knowledge. So when you're young, when you're a kid, that's when you're doing the first stuff. And he says, you're supposed to make it fun for the kids, right? I love this. Page 71, no trace of slavery ought to mix with the studies of the freeborn man. Well, okay, so there's another class, slaves who aren't getting educated at all.
Except in Meno.
No study pursued under compulsion remains rooted in the soul. So if you really want somebody to learn, you have to make it fun. I like that.
Make it interesting to them. So even way back then, there was this desire to help kids or help young people be engaged in what they're learning. But I think that's an interesting and an important point, that he really seems to believe that this is a very gradual process.
Yes, not until you're 20 years old are you allowed to go on to study the mathematics, to find what he calls what you've been learning as kids in no particular order, he says, must now be brought within the compass of a single survey to show the kinship which exists between them and that which is. So in order, it's very much like what we're trying to do with the University Foundations programs, which is draw connections between all these disparate classes that you have and have you see the big picture for how they fit. And you're kind of at the right age, according to Socrates, too. Well, some of you may be.
Most of you. Or maybe a little past that, some of you.
But
I love that idea, again, that the next level of education is taking all these separate pieces that you learned in these disconnected classes maybe. I know they seem disconnected for me as I was going through middle and high school. You'd go to one class, you go to the next class, and then to be able to come to a class, hopefully a class like this one, where you get to see, oh my gosh, that actually has something to do with this other thing. Math is not completely separate from literature or history or music, but they're related to each other, and they can help me to understand both subjects. And so that's part of the reason that in the Republic, the perfect leader for Plato is older, right? At least 50 by the time you could become one of these rotating philosopher kings.
Also as a warrior. They have to have experience as a warrior.
Experience, I think that's important too.
Yes, experience also as a warrior. They have to have experience as a warrior too. So that's considered important along with the more academic skills.
Right.
Only then are they wise enough, do they have enough prudence to actually rule.
And so that's something to think about. This week's discussion board asks you to compare what Plato talks about in terms of education for leaders with what we think leaders of our country or countries in the modern world need to have. And I'll be really interested to see what you come up with in relation to this, because it's something that we still debate a lot. What prepares someone to be an effective leader in our country? And
it's a fascinating time to be asking this question, because we have elections coming up on both the national and the local levels this fall. And so we should be asking ourselves, what do we want of our rulers? What kind of education, what kind of preparation should they have to be, we don't have an ideal society, far from it, but we at least like to do the best we can.
If there is such thing as an ideal society. One other thing to think about as you're reading is what he leaves out. What are those things that aren't included in his education for leaders, and why not? For instance, there is nothing here about experience with a knowledge of the law,
history,
business, the arts of other kinds. I mean, music, but there's no painting, there's no literature, nothing like that. Mm-hmm. And so, well, why not? And is he right or wrong?
Very good questions. Are we done?
I think we're done.
Okay,
Talk to you later.
As always, we hope that we've left you with more questions than answers. That's the way we usually leave each other.
Good questions, though.
Keep thinking.